Okay, so what I want to talk about now is developing your own research project. This is just sort of a mini lecture that I'm adding to this week. What I want to talk about a bit is research questions, choosing a problem, literature reviews, and internet searches. So there's lots of reasons, why people come up with projects. One of them is assignment. When I started out as a graduate student years ago, I worked in a laboratory by a psychologist named Jane Ellen Huttenlocker. I started out doing really low-level work transcribing videos of children talking with their parents because she was interested in language. But she had other interests in spatial development. And so she had an idea for an experiment that she sort of took me aside and she said, "You know what? I think you're a good worker, so I want to give you a project." And so she told me about this idea, had to do with liquid being in containers. I'll post the study so that you can read it, so that you can know where I started in coming up with my first idea. What I did is I figured out all the technical challenges of how to do the study in a way that would be successful. It ended up being my master's thesis, it was published and it was a decent paper. But it's an example of how sometimes, people do work on projects that were kind of handed to them. I often tell graduate students, I'm the graduate program director at Rutgers Camden in psychology, and I often tell them to, you know, don't come to the program with a project on your own. Come with willing to work in someone's lab because someone might be working on something that's already interesting and it would be, a great project to sort of get your hands wet. Because, at the beginning of your career, you don't know what you're doing. It's like, it's not like, babies start out life by eating steak. You start out with milk and then you move on to like biscuits and soft foods and things like that. You don't start off with the kind of project that's going to appear in the journal Science or Nature. Um, Another way is serendipity. A problem might fall into your lap. That is the case for my work I do work in wind energy and, people's opinions about wind energy. That happened because, um, I somehow got involved in teaching about environmental issues. I do research in environmental psychology, and someone said, "You know what? There's very little do you have any information on what people think about offshore wind energy?" And I'm like, "Well, there's not that many studies out there." So, I was like, "Well, I should do one." And so that's the paper that I'm working on now. Personal investment. There are a lot of people that have, uh, a sibling who might have autism or, a parent that might have high blood pressure or diabetes, and that might get them interested in doing research on that topic. So they might have a personal investment in it. And then there's also collaboration. I'm my master's degree actually is in statistics, not psychology. And so often people ask me, "Oh, I have a project I'm working on. I don't know how to do the statistics. Would you collaborate with me? And can be an author on the paper, but you'll do the statistics." And, you know, um, the other people, um, have different skill sets in academia. So it may be that someone asks you to collaborate on a project. So that's normally what happens. But I kind of like talking about it in terms of, um, you know, uh, yeah, and I went on to this slide, but I'll talk about this slide in a minute. Um, I think that for this project that you're going to do in this class, think about something that pisses you off, something that annoys you. Like, why do people drive in a way that is rude and prone to cause accidents? You know, why, you know, are people, at the store, so unwilling to let you cut in front in line if you have only one object. You see, this is one of the things that I noticed in France that's different in the US. I live in France during the summer. In Paris, if you have one item, you can go to the front of the line and ask the person, "Oh, I only have one item. I can, most of the time people let you go. It's sort of like a thing to do over there. But if you try that here in the US, you're going to be, yelled at, told to get to the back of the line. Um, you know, it would be interesting to do a study, seeing, going to a food store and having one item and going to the front of the line, see how many people reject you doing that. But, I want you to look around, this week or these next couple of days to walk around and think about like what are things out there that confuse you, that mystify you, that annoy you. Often that's really the greatest place to start with a study, you know. Um, so that's, just kind of an aside, but here what I want to talk about are, some famous cases, why study something? Well, sometimes there's paradoxes out there, you know. During World War II, there's a man named Adolf Eichmann, and he was in charge of the trains in Nazi Germany. And what he did was he made the train system very easy to bring groups of people to the extermination centers. And After the war, he kind of escaped to South America. The Israelis kidnapped him, put him on trial. And, he would always argue that, I just was doing what I was told, you know, and, I just made the trains run on time. He was eventually executed. But the point is that, Stanley Milgram, famous Yale, social psychologist, looked at this and said, well, was he evil? Or would any of us do this? And that's why he did his experiments on obedience to authority. The experiment I described last week, or last module, having to do with shocking people to death. As I told you, 80% of participants gave a lethal shock because some guy in a white lab coat told them to. Of course, they didn't give the lethal, there was no shock at all. But the idea being that, we tend to think that, like, oh, I would never do that. But, history repeats itself, or if it doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. And so that's an example of where, a paradoxical incident led to that. Another one was this UFO cult for a guy named Leon Festinger, who, noted that there was a cult that, thought that this one date in the 1950s that a UFO would come down to their religious, there was a strange religious sect, and they would take everyone up to another planet. What happened is that, that date came, everyone waited on the top of a mountain, and of course, no UFO came because that wasn't going to happen. And what he dealt with is how did the people deal with the fact that it didn't. Well, the way in which the person, the leader of the cult, kind of said is that, oh, we actually have been abducted by the spaceship, but it just looks like we're still on Earth because the aliens have made it feel that way. Completely ridiculous, but all of these people believed it. And so he came up with this theory of cognitive dissonance based on that, which is an important theory in social psychology. Um, Other ways of coming study the analogical reasoning. You might want to study propaganda and be inspired by the way that viruses spread, that propaganda can spread in similar ways. Or metaphors, the mind as a computer or as a machine. There's a whole the cognitive science revolution that occurred in the 1960s in cognitive science occurred because, computers were being developed at that time, and we were using the computer as kind of a metaphor for describing how the brain works or how the mind works. Um, but there's also accounts that, for conflicting results. There's something called the fundamental attribution error, which is that when explaining why someone did something, it's particularly something bad. In America, people usually say, oh, he's a bad person. It has something to do with something internal to the individual. Whereas in East Asia, you don't find that. East Asians tend to say that it's because, oh, he was in a stressful situation, or that, oh, he was surrounded by, bad people that influenced him. They tend not to sort of attribute, um, you know, motives to the individual, but they look at the context, the surrounding social context. That's not found so much in the United States. Um, and I'm just going to skip that next one because I would move on. Um, Also, why study something? Because you can improve on earlier findings. I did an experiment, maybe I'll post this one called the frame line test, and it was an improvement on what someone had done before me called the rod and frame test. So I was just basically improving on an earlier methodology. Um, and in reality, Milgram's experiment really was just an improvement on another one by Solomon Asch. Remember, as I always say, that, you're not the first person to study something in the field. There's always, other examples. Um, okay, so What you always want to do is come up with a working hypothesis. And remember what a hypothesis is. It's a statement that you assume to be true for the purpose of testing. Okay. So it could be something like, men are more likely to run stop signs than women. Okay. Now, what do? You can go and then you can test that by standing at a stop sign and looking at cars that, who stops and who doesn't. Okay. That's a very easy one to do. Um, you could do an internet survey of Facebook friends and ask, do a survey of, how likely are you to, um, exercise today, and your test would be that people who spend less time on the internet will be more likely to exercise. You can test that by asking people how many hours you spend on the internet and, watching TikTok videos or whatever, and how often do you go to the gym. But again, a hypothesis is a statement that you assume is true for the purpose of testing. So I want you to start thinking about topics that you might be interested in and exploring in depth. Okay? Think about things that are relevant to your own life. Things that, I've had students in the past. I had a student that was a flight attendant and she had cancer, and she had many of her friends who were flight attendants had cancer. And so what she designed a study where she looked at people who were flight attendants and then looked at people who were ground crew to see whether or not, being in the air because you're exposed to more radiation when you're up in an airplane. I hope you know that. It's not a ton of irradiation, but there's less air to sort of protect you or shield you from the radiation. And so, that's a problem when you spend so much time under higher radiation, it, will more likely lead to mutations and to cancers. So, that was something that she was very invested in. Um, Anita, the student that did that study on restaurant tipping, she wanted to see how can I increase my tips, you know? So I want you to think of something that may be relevant to your own life that you can explore, that you can measure, and think also about being able to complete it during this course. I don't think that you're going to be able to do something that's so extensive that you can, I only want you to test 10 to 20 people. This is not a project that's going to be published. This is just for you to get the feeling of what it's like to do a research project. So think about how you're going to collect your data and what your data is going to look like. Also think of a project that's going to be fun to do. Okay. You're not going to be, um, y- you know, I don't want you to be doing something that's going to be expensive, that's going to be challenging, that's going to take a ton of time. If you're doing that example of looking at men and women running stop signs, I want you just to spend an hour, with a clipboard and imagine, having columns, male, female, ran stop sign, did not run stop sign. Okay. But I don't want you to do a project that's questionable in terms of ethics. So no zapping babies, no testing the effects of marijuana on driving skills, or getting hurt yourself. Okay. No doing anything silly, no pranks, nothing that's going to do harm. Just do something simple and boring that's going to be very interesting to you and to your reader, which is me. So here's some examples. Are SUV owners aggressive? Okay, there's a public perception that SUV owners might be inconsiderate. How could you explore that? Well, you could look up accident data from the National Highway Safety Board and compare SUVs to sedans. That data is out there. That's one of the things that governments do is collect a lot of data. So you could go to you know, um, the Department of Transportation and find data on this. You could stand on a corner and observe how many SUVs run red lights or stop signs relative to sedans. Or you could survey people who own cars and people who own SUVs, and give them a scale of something that might tap into aggressiveness. Like, there could be scales of aggression out there that one could use, compassion scales, whatever. But that could be, again, there are many ways of measuring, these theoretical constructs. Sex differences in friendship. Evolutionary psychology predicts that women form larger same-sex networks than men. Okay. How would you test this? You could go to a cafeteria and see whether or not, the average size of all female groups compare with those of all male groups, by looking at the number of people at the cafeteria table. Or ask men and women to count all their friends from their cell phone's memory bank or live journal page or, you know, Facebook or Instagram and compare the proportion of same-sex friends or versus opposite-sex friends that are listed. Um, you know, uh, Estimating averages. I did this research years ago. People are good at implicitly but not explicitly estimating the average of a distribution of numbers. You could show people a series of house ads with prices included and tell half of them before estimation to keep track of the average, but don't tell the other half until after. Okay, and that would be like a true experiment. And whether or not the people that are just gleaning them are better than those that are actually trying to calculate them in their head. Okay. So, no matter what, how you come up with a problem, the first step is always to conduct a literature search. Okay. Why? Because as smart as you are, you're not the first person to ever wrestle with a particular problem. But of course, you might be more clever than people in the past. And you also have new technology. 20 years ago, we didn't have Facebook and Instagram and all these websites that governments have. So maybe you're smarter and you're able to get, different information than people in the past. Okay. So your first step should be just a Google search to see what could be out there. Wikipedia page. I know that many professors say, "Oh, Wikipedia is bad." I think that Wikipedia is great. So, if you're interested in aggression, then look at the, Wikipedia page for aggression. At the bottom, there's a bunch of links to the works that are cited there. You might find a good article on there. But the second thing that you need to do is go to Google Scholar. Because Google Scholar is a database of hundreds of thousands of articles, millions of articles published in academic journals going back centuries. So you'll be able to access information that might be relevant for the question that you're asking. So I want you to, at this point, to come up with, a topic that you're interested in. And I want you to do a Google search where Google Scholar search. And again, let me just, I'll show you. I know I showed you this before, but I'll show you it again. You just need to have a website, new window, and let me go to Google Scholar. Let's type in Google Scholar, and I'm going to put in, let's say that you're interested in whether or not men or women are funnier, gender and humor. Okay. Here we have a PDF. It's from 2006, so it's a little bit old. And we can just click there. And, usually it will just pop up. It needs me to verify that I'm human. And here we go. Gender and human, the state of the art. That sounds like a really good article to start with if you're interested in the influence of gender and humor, right? Let's say that you're interested in the aggressiveness of drivers. Aggression, AGG, aggression, gender, and driving. Okay. Wow. Gender, driver aggression, and driver violence, and applied evaluation. Click right there. Okay. And there we go. you know? And again, look, we have, the title, we have the abstract, and remember what I was saying in the other lecture. You have the introduction, right? There is a problem, and we go down. This is telling more about the problem. And then here are, look, they even tell you exactly what their hypothesis is. Okay, there will be no gender differences in rating of mild aggressive behaviors. High stress drivers will report great mild aggression than low stress drivers, and so on. And what do we have here? Method. Remember, participants, measures. So this is giving people remember the word I use, self-report, right? People are going to be reporting on a survey that they do, and we have results. Okay, here are these are called correlations. We'll talk about them. Here are the averages, right? The mean means average. That's another word for mean. Standard deviation, the variability. Um, Maybe I'll download this article and actually put it up online so that you can read it. It seems like a pretty simple article. Now, of course, when you read this, you're going to probably come across terms in statistics that you don't know. Don't worry about that. That actually was my first problem when I was doing in one of my first early classes in psychology is that, I saw the word ANOVA and I didn't know what it was. I was 18 years old. I never had a stats class. Of course, now I run ANOVAs all the time. But just, don't when you encounter a word in a method section that you don't quite know what it is, again, it's just another way of determining whether or not the result is real or not, or is the result just randomness? Okay. But if we go down, it gives you more results. And then we have our discussion. Okay. And I go down here. Um, and remember what I said. What was the last thing that you should say in your paper? Limitations of the present study. Okay. So this is going to be Okay, so I put together the lecture for writing in psychology after this one. So when I said that, do you remember what I said last time? That's actually going to be in the next lecture. But all papers have this kind of a format, okay? And your paper is going to look much like this. So I'm going to actually upload this paper to uh, the website so that you can take a look at it as an example of. I just pulled this one up. You could pull up your own. And that's one of the things that I'm going to have you do in the assignment is to, in one of the assignments, is to do something similar than that. So I want you to start thinking about what you're going to do your research project on and start doing this kind of a literature search. And again, I want you to get the research bug. I want you to get excited about this because really, I've been doing this for 25 years now and it's been a really satisfying life and I love teaching it to people and I hope that you find it the same way. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and I will see you next time. Uh, yeah, I already did the lecture. The next one I think is on writing and psychology. That lecture is already done. So you'll see that one in the next module, and I will see you after that one. Okay, bye-bye.